Hi, my name is KJ Bunko, and this is the L.A.M.B podcast. So today I have a guest here, Micah Green, who is currently a professor at Texas A&M for chemical engineering, and he also is an elder here at our church. So let's just get right into it. So Micah, as you know, most people are born and then they get older. I can tell you are older than a newborn.
Yeah.
So let's just kind of go through your life. Starting from growing up as a kid.
You bet. Yeah. So I'm thank you, KJ. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm a child of the Texas Panhandle.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. My hometown is Borger, Texas, which is north of Amarillo, way up there. Most people in this part of Texas only go that way if they're like heading toward Colorado.
Yeah.
So my parents were both strong believers. My mom had grown up in the church, and my dad did not. He had a really, really remarkable conversion when he was about 18.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was interesting to see the two of them, but they definitely raised me and my younger siblings in the church. We went to First Baptist Church. We were there. If the doors of the church were open, we were there.
Yeah.
And I had a very clear and distinct, boom, conversion experience when I was 7 years old.
7?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm 7, so it's like God saved me from Kool-Aid and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, right? So, but still, there was a sense of you are 7, you are old enough to decide, is this something you want to commit yourself to? And I had this sense of decision time, and then I made that decision. I remember only a few things about that experience. I know I cried a lot. I know my parents were very supportive and comforting kind of through the whole thing, and appreciated that I was able to make that decision. I remember I made that decision on my mom's birthday when I was 7 years old. So my mom always thought it was sweet that it was her birthday and my spiritual birthday. We could always remember it for that reason. My parents really emphasized scripture at home. We did a lot of scripture memory. We definitely knew our Bibles. And also my parents were very open about knowing why you believed what you believed. So one story I've told many times is that when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, I saw there was something in the Bible that didn't quite match. One of the Gospels told the story one way and one of them told it another way. And I was like, I don't understand. How does this fit?
Yeah.
And someone at church was like, shut up, and just kind of shut me down. And I was like, oh gosh, am I not allowed to ask these questions? Anyway, it was not good. But my dad found out about this, and he took me by the face, and he said, you can ask any question you want. You can ask any question you want. The Bible can take it. And I was like, because it wasn't just that I was worried that my faith is wrong. I was worried that there are certain kind of topics you're not supposed to bring up. And my dad was like, it's fine. You can ask questions and investigate and be open to other points of view without being scared because you have a confident, secure faith.
Yeah.
And I was like, anyway, that was very helpful.
Yeah.
I think probably the second moment when I had to kind of own my faith was when I was 15. This is back in the 90s. My father took me up to Denver for a Promise Keepers conference. And we fished and hiked and stuff, kind of a couple of side adventures on the way up there.
Promise Keepers?
Promise Keepers was a big deal back in the 90s. It was a big movement. It was actually started by the University of Colorado head coach of football, Bill McCartney. And the idea of Promise Keepers was to call men. The idea was that Christian men broadly were being pretty passive and not leading their families and not giving of themselves sacrificially. And this movement really hit my church hard. I can remember there were a bunch of men in my church who very publicly repented. I have been passive in terms of spiritual leadership in my family. I have been passive and not loved my wife in a Christ-like way. And so it made a really big impact on my church. So then I went with my dad to the big Promise Keepers rally in the Broncos Stadium in Denver.
Really?
And it was 70,000 men singing Holy, Holy, Holy. It was awesome.
Yeah.
And it was also a sense, I learned more about my dad's own spiritual story. And there was a sense of this is what it means to be a man, right? What is your manhood goal? And I felt like God gave me a really clear sense of to be a man means to follow me. And it's not all about satisfying your own ambitions. We have no ambition aside than to glorify Christ. And that's frequently done through taking responsibility, being willing to sacrifice for others. That's what defines a man. So that was really helpful to me also. Kind of the third big moment I had, just in terms of forming who I am, After I finished my undergraduate degree at Texas Tech, I went to get my PhD at MIT. Moved to Boston. That was a big culture shift, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And that first winter in Boston, Texans, it's hard to believe this, but like Boston is so far north and so far east in its time zone that like it gets dark early.
Really?
And it is cold. And so it's just a long, cold, dark winter. And I began to think, I'd always been interested in apologetics. Like, here's why I believe what I believe. And I engaged with I had a lot of friends who were atheists or agnostics and that sort of thing. But that first winter in Boston, I started to think like, what if they're right? What if they're right? If they're right and the world is just atoms and energy and that's it, that means that when I die, I stop existing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if y'all like really thought that through, but it's pretty horrifying, the idea of like, no, it won't be like blank, or you experiencing like you. There is no you. Yeah. You're gone. And I was really horrified by that, especially the idea that like if they were right, you can also do nothing about it. Nothing you can do. And then I thought like, oh, that's horrible. I don't want that to be true. I don't want that to be true. I thought, what if my faith in Jesus is something that's just, I want it to be true? What if it's just wish fulfillment? And so I got real messed up for a while. There was probably, 3 to 6 months where I was just like, oh no, everything I believe is just because I want it to be true. How do I know it's actually true? And I eventually came out of that through several different things. One is this super skeptical move that says, you only believe this because blank is a bit of a logical fallacy. You can't prove a belief false just by asserting a possible motivation for that belief.
Yeah.
You have to actually show that the belief is false before you start coming up with explanations why someone might have that false belief. But it skips the actual like hard work of the argument. Basically, any fool can be a skeptic. Any fool can be like, oh, you only believe this because blank. Like that applies to the skeptic as well. So that's not very helpful. The other thing that really hit me and like really changed the way I think about humanity and about science is I started thinking, if the naturalists, the atheists are right and the universe is just atoms and energy, then what does that say about my mind? It means that like I am a biochemical soup that does what it's biochemically programmed to do. Mm-hmm. I'm not really rational. I also don't have any conscious experience. I don't have a mind. I only have a brain. And so it's just a biochemical soup and that's it. And I'll never forget this feeling of thinking like, so if they're right, I'm just a biochemical soup that just does whatever it's biologically programmed to do. So why am I listening to myself?
Yeah.
And I thought this idea that like, if you reduce humanity just down to a meat computer, you actually undermine your confidence in human cognitive reliability, in human rationality, and even in human consciousness. Like I got to the point where I thought, if they're right, there is no me. There is no me. It's just a collection of atoms and that's it. And so the naturalist worldview reduces humans down to something. And then eventually you'll start affirming things that you know aren't true. So if I say, I'm not conscious, I have no subjective first person experience, like I know that's false because I experience consciousness directly. Yeah. And so I thought that means naturalism leads me to start affirming things that I know aren't true. So therefore naturalism is false. That actually helped me to like start saying like, actually my science and my faith start working together really well. Science requires that the scientist, that their mind be rational, conscious, and ethical, and that they can use their mind to understand how the universe is put together.
Because if I understand theology, it's called the queen of all sciences.
Sure, that's what they would said back in the medieval universities. Yeah. The reason that makes sense is that's why it would affect your view of science is, how do I know that I can use my mind to understand the way the universe exists? For a Christian, it's very easy to explain that. You say, God made the universe, God made my mind, God wants me to use my mind to understand the universe. He wants me to do it. And that's when you say like, oh, actually Christianity is not opposed to science at all. It's actually a close friend of science. And this is why when you read people like Kepler and Pascal, they say, God made us to study the scientific world. He wants us to use our microscopes. He wants us to use our telescopes to understand the order that he imposed on the world so that we can understand the way the world works. Yeah. So that was really helpful for me. So anyway, those are kind of like the big, you asked me to tell my story. I think those are the big like chapters in my life that kind of formed who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. I really want to get into, or I really want to talk about how, like in your household, like your parents brought you up in this space where you were free to ask questions, where you
Mm-hmm.
were free to be skeptical, which is interesting because at least for me as a Catholic, it was, well, you're going to a Catholic school. This is what you this is what we believe. You're just gonna believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting, and I can see how that correlates to what you're doing now here at
Sure,
the
sure,
church.
yeah.
Why don't you fill people in a little bit on what you do here as an elder?
Yeah, so I have a number of different roles. My roles on campus, I'm a professor and I have a research group, and that eats up a lot of my time. At home, I'm a father. I'm a father of four, and I have a sweet wife as well. And then at church, I'm one of the elders here at New Life. Elder is equivalent to pastor. Um, I'm not a staff pastor. I have a separate job, but
Mm-hmm.
basically the goal is to lead and take care of the church. The word pastor literally means shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
So that means we're constantly on the lookout to like make sure every member of the church is well cared for, that we bear one another's burdens, and that we help each other to grow in grace. For me, most of my giftings, most of my abilities are related to teaching.
Yeah.
So I do preach on occasion. I got to preach just a couple months ago. And then I work a lot with our college students like you. And we every Sunday we have our college coffee and conversation, which means that we have really more of a led discussion on whatever the topic is. We've done a number of different topics over the years. Last spring, we talked a lot about spiritual disciplines like prayer and reading scripture, even fasting, right? Then last semester, we talked at much more broad theology about what does it mean to glorify God, and how does glorifying God animate every part of the Christian life. More recently, we've talked about a Christian approach to the ethics surrounding gender and sexuality. So, but every week we lead a discussion, and we have great college students here at New Life, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. The real downside, though, is that my teaching partners keep graduating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I work with graduate students, and when you live in a college town, you make some sweet friends, and then they always graduate. They leave. So
Because Tim was here
yeah.
like 2 semesters ago, right?
Yeah, that's right. He's now a professor up at Messiah College in Pennsylvania.
And then
Yusuf.
yeah, Yusuf. Wait, did he also graduate as?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering. Oh, I haven't seen him around.
Yep, that's right.
And then Caleb, I mean,
Caleb's in the middle of his PhD program as well. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, I guess another thing I want to get into is because you said you have a passion for teaching, and that's something you believe God has called you to.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for someone who's like thinking, well, is this the kind of vocation that God has for me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some signs you saw in yourself like early on that you think they're good indicators that?
Oh, that you might be called to teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. We all have things in our life that take up our time, right? Things take up time, but not everything takes up your energy.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And so whenever I teach, I do this a lot on campus. I speak to different groups. I spoke at Navigators last week. Whenever I teach, especially on spiritual topics, it may take up my time, but it never takes up my energy.
Yeah.
It always energizes me. I'm like, that was great. Let's do some more.
Yeah.
And I'm excited. And frequently I feel like I don't really know a topic until I can teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
So those kind of indicators that like teaching energizes you, even when it takes up time, it still energizes you and makes you feel like this is what I'm called to do.
Mm-hmm.
When you feel like teaching helps you, the act of figuring out how do I teach this to someone else helps you see things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Those are the kind of things that I think animate my teaching on a regular basis. So, but ultimately, like, think about the best teachers you've ever had. They're always excited to be there. They care about the students. They say, I care about you. I'm excited for you to learn this. And they think that it's a privilege to get to teach. So that is one area where teaching, like the same attitudes about teaching, that like this is a calling, this is a beautiful opportunity, shows up for me on campus as a professor and at church.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, because I feel like there's a lot of things that a person can be good at or can like enough, but never be like really excited about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You did bring up an interesting thing about how theology, or God and science go together. A, that's something that we're not really seeing from, I guess, the mainstream media. That there's a separation between science and God. So I guess go in a little bit more depth on that connection,
Sure.
and maybe later on, like, where do you think that diversion of that idea comes from?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I actually gave a talk, an online talk. You can find it on YouTube
Mm-hmm.
to Christian grads called "Science and Scientism." All right. So I think the concept of scientism will help answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
Scientism is the belief that the only route to truth is through science.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't know something via scientific investigation, you cannot know it.
Mm-hmm.
And that attitude is all over the place, right? We'll say like, oh, well, there's facts. Here, facts are things we investigate through science. Everything else is kind of like just an opinion or a taste, even like that. You have your preferences, but these are things over here are facts. So basically what I want to do is push back against scientism. That phrase, you can only know things that you can scientifically prove. Can that statement be scientifically proven? Nope.
No.
It's a philosophy, and that's why it's almost like a rule that breaks itself. Like if I tell you all sentences in English are a lie, you'd be like, that sentence was in English, so
Yeah.
why should I listen to you? So scientism has that same kind of problem. The reason scientism is widespread is because like it's hard to get people to agree on things other than science. Like everybody agrees on how the air conditioner works. At least we can get everybody on the planet to kind of like say, we got it. We agree on how the air conditioner works. That's science. But we can't get people to agree on economics, politics, religion, ethics. Like it seems like we have a hard time getting agreement. Yeah. So science at least gives us a way of like investigating the natural world and coming up with something that's fairly objective and doesn't change across time and cultures and things like that. So science is great at figuring out the natural world. Scientism makes the mistake of saying that's the only thing I can know. And then usually it goes the extra step of saying the natural world is all I can know. So as far as I'm concerned, that's all that exists.
Yeah.
Right? Once you say that, then it's like religion, ethics, miracles, anything else is like all off the table.
Yeah.
So I think that is most of where the perceived conflict between science and religions comes from. Science is great at what it is good at, but as soon as you say science is the only game in town, that's the only way I can know truth, then you not only jettison religion, you actually jettison most of philosophy, certainly all of ethics. Yeah. And so I think we have to call out scientism as a pretty hollow philosophy.
Yeah. You definitely pigeonhole yourself into believing a lot of certain things that like you can't believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard an interesting illustration of the trouble with scientism from this was from Oxford mathematician John Lennox. Mm-hmm. He was here at A&M a few years ago.
Really?
Yep. He gave the following illustration. If we say, why is the water boiling? Why is the water boiling? There's lots of different explanations. You could talk about heat transfer. You can talk about thermodynamics of like why is it that when water gets to a certain temperature that it begins to boil, and give all kinds of scientific explanations. But Lennox says, in this case, the water is boiling because I would like some tea. So he's preparing tea. So the idea of like purpose, meaning, agency, why do we, like, if you restrict yourself to, I can only talk about science, then you actually like can't describe a lot of the actual world. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, that second part of the question is like, where does that diversion happen? Because it, at least from what I understand, like the church has always been against science. That's why, burn witches at the stake. That's why, I think it was Galileo. He was, I think he was put on trial by the Catholic Church. So like, I guess if you can get a little bit into like how
Sure.
that diversion of that science and theology.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a historical feeling that like that science and religion have some beef with one another. Mm-hmm. I don't really think that's true. The Galileo example is a good one. Right? Galileo was saying like, look at the telescope, look what we see, and I think what was at root in the Galileo incident was not religion, but rather power, right? As soon as religious authority is vested in the hands of people who have power, and they say, like, you do not have the right to disagree with me, then I think we have a problem. Almost every time that Christianity has gone astray, it's almost always because Christianity is used as a means to power.
Yeah.
That happens even today, right? If some politician says, "Oh, I can use Christianity to help me stay in power," then there's a problem. Um, so there, I guess let me try to give a couple of big picture questions on where science and the church might run into trouble. One is big picture questions. So a big picture question would be something like, science says that miracles are impossible. Mm-hmm. That'd be a very big picture question that causes all kinds of like conflict.
Yeah.
I think those kind of statements, people usually haven't thought it through. So for instance, science says that based on natural forces, if just natural forces are at play, dead people stay dead, mm-hmm. right? So does Christianity contradict that? No, right? Christianity says it's not just natural forces at play. This is not something naturally happened. This is something supernaturally happening. Mm. We would be right to say naturally dead people stay dead, but when Jesus was resurrected, there is a supernatural force at work. Mm. So I'll give you an illustration that helps me think about the topic of miracles and whether miracles are scientifically possible. Okay. If you and I are playing pool, and you say like, all right, let's say I do it. I say I'm going to strike. I'm going to take the cue stick. I'm going to strike the ball, and it is going to hit that side, and then it's going to bounce into the pocket. Physics says it's so. Science says it's so. It is going to happen.
Yeah.
We've got everything. Like we do the calculations. It's going to happen. When I strike the ball, it's going to go off that thing, and then it's going to go in the corner pocket, right?
Yeah.
Then I strike the ball, and you grab the ball.
Yeah.
Did we disprove science? No. When I did the calculation, I kind of like drew a little dotted line around the table and said nothing outside the table is going to interfere. If that assumption is true, then the ball was in the corner pocket. But that assumption wasn't true. You are outside the table and you reached in and you grabbed the ball and changed something. That is what a miracle is. God reaches in and changes something. Now at this point, scientists are like, oh man, I don't know. I can't have God like messing with my experiment. I can't admit the possibility of the supernatural coming in and like messing with the laws of physics and messing up my experiment. But as Christians, we don't believe God would do that, right? God lets the laws of nature, laws of physics operate normally. And if he interferes to raise someone from the dead, to heal someone, if an actual like, God reaches in and changes something, that happens for a religious purpose. Mm-hmm. Meaning like when Jesus healed someone, he doesn't just do it like, yay, you're healed. It was also to show who he was. Yeah. Right. So miracles don't happen willy-nilly. So that's how you can be a scientist. I go do my experiments. I say experiments are fine, but I still believe that miracles are possible because they happen in a religious context. It's not any laws of physics being violated. It's God reaching in with something supernatural rather than natural to do the miracle. So those are the big picture questions as it relates to science and faith. The more specifics are when, Christians and scientists have definitely disagreed with each other, like, how old is the earth? How did life come to be? Yeah. Those are pretty specific, and some of that has to do with how you interpret Genesis, and I won't get into all that. I will tell you that like Christians definitely disagree with each other, on some of these points. So I think you got to actually go in and do your homework and figure out what different Christians say. I will tell you, I was raised in like the hardcore, young Earth, etc. kind of Christian background, and then I found out that like some of the early church fathers in the 300s and 400s disagreed with each other on how to read Genesis. Yeah. And I was like, oh, so Christians disagree with each other. This is not, my earlier thought of like, oh, it has to be, this is the only way to read Genesis. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm wrong. And so when you open yourself up and recognize where Christians disagree with each other, then you say, maybe I shouldn't be so, stick in the ground about this. So.
Yeah, because I think it's, maybe it's not like a big thing that a lot of Christians think about, but when there's certain instances, especially if you're like a university student, so you're actively learning about physics and like the natural world and how it works, you start to have these questions of like, how does that all fit in together? Because scientists that we look to for a lot of things say that the Earth is billions of years old. The Bible says it's 7 days, so finding that I guess really because it really just depends on how you look at Genesis. Personally, for me, I was initially taking it at straight face value, but I'm kind of switching more towards it's less of a literal. It's literally what God's doing, but more of like a story, and like in it, or like it's more of like a fictional story that's trying to like actual truth. Like
One thing I would encourage you when it comes to interpreting Genesis, I think I first encountered this in the books of John Walton. He's a New Testament or an Old Testament scholar. Walton says you have to read Genesis in the context of like who wrote it and then who's the original intended audience. The phrase he always uses is the Bible is written for us, but it's not written to us. That's a lot of cases where that's obviously true. If you and I think earlier today we were talking about 1 Corinthians, we're reading Paul's mail, right? Paul wrote a letter to the church at Corinth.
Yeah.
So this is a letter from Paul to the church at Corinth. The principles there apply to us, and God wanted us to have this. But still, we have to know who's writing it and who's the audience.
Yeah.
That applies to Genesis as well. So the example Walton gives is you and I may ask, like, how old is the moon? When did the stuff of the moon first begin to exist? But it's possible the original audience, like, they're not even thinking about that question.
Yeah.
They're comparing themselves against like Egypt and Babylon and the other ancient Near Eastern powers. And those ancient Eastern powers would say, oh, the moon is a goddess.
Yeah.
And then you go to Genesis, and Genesis says, the moon is not divine. It is not a goddess. There is one God, and he made the moon. Why did he make the moon? To be a light. And so this is the moon's function, right? It is a created thing that God created for something good, to structure and order the creation. And then if you and me in the 21st century are like, but how old is it? And how old are the rocks? They'd be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So we may be imposing our questions on the text in a way that the original author and audience are like, you're asking questions we're not looking at.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, because that's the slippery slope about the Bible. It's you want to, because you're supposed to read. I think it's exegesis. That's the term. You know.
Yeah. Read out of the text.
Read out of it, and not eisegesis, like into.
Read my own stuff into it.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to go back to kind of shift gears a little bit. So most Christians in their everyday life, the Bible says we're going to struggle. That's just how it is. And you talked about a little bit about when you were struggling with your faith during your time at Boston and being at MIT. And if you could go a little bit more in depth into giving a little bit more context to that situation and like where you were.
Well, I think when we struggle like with doubts, what seems plausible to us is always affected by, like we like to think that we're like little perfect little logic bots, but we're actually not, right? We are affected by even how much light we get each day. We're affected by what we're around. We're affected by the communities that we're in. That's why for Christians, you never want to be in like Lone Ranger Christian mode, because the Bible says like, no, we're meant to live as brothers and sisters in Christ. We're meant to live in community.
Iron sharpens iron.
Yeah, and so that's right. And so if you're struggling with doubt, if you're struggling with depression, you don't want to do it alone. You want to do that in a context with other believers who care about you. And so that was certainly a help to me, being connected with other believers as opposed to like just being on my own. The other thing that was helpful to me is I started reading, this will sound weird, but like you would think that the antidote to doubt is to like read theology books and like really do it. I actually started reading a lot of J.R.R. Tolkien. Right?
Really?
Yeah, I started reading Lord of the Rings, and it had quite an effect on me. The feeling was that if the universe was like just atoms and energy and that's it, it would be pretty boring. It'd be pretty drab, pretty gray. And I thought, no, what I see when I look around is I see story. I see characters.
Yeah.
I see narrative. What I see around me seems much more like the result of an author, just like in the Tolkien books. And Tolkien himself was a believer. Like when he writes, he wants you to think things like that. Like the story he's telling is meant to point you back and say that God, the author of our story, is at work. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So also just like reading Tolkien, and then spring came in Boston and it was beautiful again. And I was like, the materialistic story doesn't really explain beauty or values or anything like that. And so I was like, I'm not willing to say beauty, that's just something humans make up. I don't think that's true. So that was valuable.
Yeah, and you kind of talked a little bit about something about how like even being about how our environment can affect us in our faith.
Yeah.
Because I think that's another part of it. Not only just recognizing that you need to be around other Christians so you can be stronger in your faith, but also realizing that for instance in Boston, I'm guessing you might have felt SAD, the seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah.
Where that can negatively affect you in the chemicals in your body, and it leads you down a depressed path and like can make you start doubting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then another thing as well is that I think that's the one of the greatest aspects about God, that he's such a great storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being first saved and my first thing I went to was the New Testament, because that's where all the little nitty gritty stuffs.
Mm-hmm.
Answers that you'll get for all the stuff that you might have as a new convert. And I wasn't ever super interested in getting into the Old Testament, because it's like, well, that's the Old Testament, it's the old stuff.
Yeah.
But finally starting getting into it, it was so much easier to get out of it, because it wasn't like the New Testament where it's like Paul telling me, sexual immorality bad. It was a story of how David, slept with Bathsheba and all the consequences behind that.
Oh,
and in some ways I found that more compelling than the New Testament.
How old were you?
It was like not last semester, but about a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting, because my personality is kind of what you described initially. Like, I would like a theology encyclopedia with all the right answers, please. Mm-hmm. And God's like, nope, here's this book, and it's got a bunch of stories.
Yeah.
And a bunch of narrative. And I'm like, but that's not what I asked for. But I think God's right that we do tend to think much more in terms of narrative. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just, like, let's say we did have my little theology encyclopedia.
Yeah.
That means like, yay, I have some right answers, but that doesn't necessarily change my heart.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what God's interested in. It's not just like a bunch of people who ace the theology exam, but someone whose heart is in line with his.
Oh, yeah. And I think that phrase, acing the theology exam, I think that's I think that was a big problem, at least initially with me and my faith before I got saved, is that like I went to a Christian school, so I knew all these little facts and stuff about Jesus and all this and that. But it never was anything that took root in my heart. Like I'm slowly starting to understand there's a difference between knowing something and believing something.
Yeah. Right.
And one thing I do want to talk about is, like I said, I got saved in my senior year. Mm-hmm. So by that time I was like already pretty much adult. I had seen what the world was and experienced it, at its worst. I mean, maybe not at its worst, but like I have a taste of what the world is. So it's very hard for me to wrap my head around people before even the ages of 10 getting saved. So I guess, and there's, a couple other people who've told me they themselves have got saved, at a very young age. Mm-hmm. So I guess if you could kind of explain.
This is, you're totally right. And this is very common. We've talked with a lot of people in our church in the same situation, where they have a salvation experience when they're, 6 or 7. And then when they're like 11, 12, 13, then they're like, oh, I don't think I knew what I was doing then. Now is the moment where I'm getting saved. Mm-hmm. And then when they're like 15, they're like, oh, no, I didn't know what I was doing. Now is the moment when I'm getting saved. And then when they're in college, they do the same thing. And I guess I would just tell people like this feeling of like, I don't think I ever really got it before until now. Like, we're just not that great at telling our own spiritual autobiography. And I don't think God requires us to do that. And so we're constantly finding ways to own our faith in a way that we hadn't before. Mm-hmm. And so this feeling of like, oh man, what was I doing when I was 7? Like, I don't even stress about it anymore. I was 7, I had certain capabilities, I had certain understandings. And as you grow, your understanding of sin and God's grace and forgiveness grows with you. So I don't think I'm ever going to get to a point where like, and now I completely understand. Like,
Yeah.
who knows? When I'm 60, I may have another moment of like, God like blows my mind. I'm like, I don't think I ever really understood the gospel until right now.
Yeah.
It's like that's good if you keep having these
Revelations.
revelations and realizing that like God's grace is bigger and more amazing than you really comprehended before.
Yeah. That's something that that I started to understand real quickly uh, as a new convert. That there's it's crazy how like the same verse or the same couple of verses, there's so many layers to it, and it hits you in different ways at different points of your life.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting. That there's almost like the Bible is almost like the ocean. You know, we'll never really ever get to understand the entirety of it, but there's just so much there for us to explore,
Right.
which I think is it. That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
really awesome. Um, and then, and then just to I guess to talk about like what you're doing, we've kind of been doing it, what you've been doing in college coffee and convo recently.
Yeah.
When we're talking, we're having these uncomfortable conversations when it comes to LGBTQ and um, how we as Christians relate on that. You mind talking a little bit about that? Real quick?
Sure. I'll give you an illustration before I get started.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe about 5 years ago, I was in Israel, and I was with a group of Christians, and we were talking to some Israelis there. And one of the things they told us is they said, "Hey, listen, when Christians try to talk to us about Jesus, you need to recognize you're not writing on a blank page."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what they meant was that like if I try to talk to them about Jesus, many Christians have come before me and been cruel and horrible to Jewish people throughout the centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I'm trying to write something very nice on the page, there's a bunch of junk on the page already from Christians who come before me who have been cruel and horrible to Jewish people. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to the LGBT community. Even though I may say like, I love you and care about you. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk like whatever it is I'm trying to say, there may be a lot of prior hurt there. And so that's a real struggle that we have to kind of walk in saying, hey, we know that you may have been hurt by the church before. You may have been treated as less than human by the church before. And we repent of that and want to make it right and want to form a relationship. So it's like before the conversation even gets started, we need to recognize that like this is an area where the church historically has done really poorly, especially the idea that they would treat some of those sins as like, oh, this is extra bad. This is extra radioactive and unforgivable. Like none of that is true. So more broadly, what we've mainly been talking about in church is the idea that Christians always want to speak the truth in love. And so if the Bible the Bible does give a certain vision for sexuality, right? That God created man and woman in his image, embodied binary sexes in relationship with each other, right? And that relationship between man and woman in marriage is supposed to mirror God's perfect love for us. And so that's what marriage is. And that means that like we actually will end up butting up against the culture that may say, oh, marriage can be different than that. And so Christians, the reason we struggle is we say, well, no, here's what we say the biblical truth is, but we don't want to say that in a way that is hurtful or minimizes what someone else is going through. Mm-hmm. So we want to be both speaking the truth and speaking in love. And so that's what we've mainly been talking about. And the example that we keep coming back to over and over again is Jesus in John chapter 4 goes to this well in the area of Samaria. This is kind of a place where the Jewish people like didn't get along with the Samaritans. Yeah. He talks to this Samaritan woman. It turns out she has a record of sexual sin, but instead of like being judgy and getting on her case, or being like lovey-dovey and like, oh, it's okay, no big deal, Jesus somehow, as he speaks to her, is able to speak both love and truth to her in a way that shows her that, yes, sexual sin matters, but God's grace is bigger than that, and that Jesus is quick to forgive and can redeem and restore us. So, yeah, I think that's the main place we've been.
Yeah. And and talking about that, I think is like incredibly impactful because as the years go by, topics such as the LGBTQ become more and more prominent.
Mm-hmm.
Even now in major cities in Texas, you'll have these huge pride parades,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
still it's almost mind-boggling that that there's enough people that are okay with that that stuff goes on, uh, but and it's a really tough topic. I don't even think that the Catholic Church uh, is on top of. I don't know if you heard recently how the Catholic Church will bless gay marriages, but they also still don't affirm them. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I can't totally make sense of
Yeah.
of the Catholic Church's stance. I guess one thing I would tell you though, like it's common in Texas for people to be like, I can't believe this is happening. Like,
Mhm.
so that comes from a confusion of like, do we live in a Christian culture, a Christian society, or not? And I think, especially after living in Boston, like the answer is like, no, we don't. But the New Testament is written in a context where Christians are a small minority amidst a much larger pluralistic, pagan kind of culture, and that's okay. So that means if Christians are a tiny little minority who believe differently than the culture around them, that's fine. We don't need to freak out.
Mm.
I'm saying that because like I feel like there are a lot of Christians who are like, "Ah, like the culture's not Christianish anymore. Who cares? That's fine. It's not a big deal. You know, we can thrive as a religious minority with great news to proclaim to everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. And we I guess today we just kind of finished up that 6 week
mhm.
stint of going through was it a couple books or just one book?
Several, yeah, yeah. Actually, just for your audience, if I had to recommend one author who has done the best job of addressing issues related to gender and sexuality, the author would be Preston Sprinkle.
Yeah.
Consistently, he speaks in such a way that shows he clearly loves and cares about people across the gender and sexuality spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
but also adheres to biblical orthodoxy. I feel like I've met a lot of people who do one or the other, but not many people who do both well, and he does both well. And he's probably the person who's influenced our structure the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Uh, I guess I guess one of my last questions for you is, God takes us through many seasons, may within a year, maybe one season within a year, or half a season in a year. So I guess my question: where do you think God has you now, or where do you think He's kind of leading you?
That's a good question. I think the thing that jumped to my mind when you asked the question is I'm starting to realize how fast and fleeting life is. I'm in my mid 40s,
Mm-hmm.
and my oldest child is 15, and I'm now having that realization of like, oh my goodness, like 4 years from now, he's like out of high school, out of my house. Like this time is precious,
Yeah.
and so I think God has kind of told me like He said, you're in a season where you need to these are precious moments. You need to make the most of them. That means teaching moments, every chance that you get, loving moments, every chance you get, not just with my own children, but even with the college students that I interact with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but like living in a college town is kind of a heartbreaking thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Like you're constantly forming relationships and then they graduate and go off and leave. And I think God has said like, that's okay. Make the most of the time you have, right? I firmly believe that Texas A&M is special and New Life is special because this is the kind of place college students come, they grow, they get trained to become leaders, they get a vision for God's calling on their life.
Mm-hmm.
And if they graduate and leave and go out and make a difference for God's kingdom elsewhere, then that's good. And I want to affirm you. That's the way I think about you, buddy.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Thank you for that.
yeah.
And one last thing I always like to do is I always like to ask my guests, or give them the opportunity to ask a question of me.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for you, trying to think of how to best phrase it. How do you keep how do your emotions? It seems like your emotions just must be on a roller coaster throughout like the collegiate life, like
Mm-hmm.
stress, friends, not enough time,
Yeah.
not enough sleep. Like, what is it like to kind of keep your emotions on the level as a college student?
Well, disclaimer: I don't do it well.
Okay, all right, yeah,
But I think it really just comes down to the little things that I do in the beginning of the day, the little things that I, at least should be doing at the end and in the middle. So one things that I really love that I did in my freshman year, it's like first thing in the morning is take a walk. There's this little park at this the apartment complex that I used to live at, and take a walk, listen to some worship music
Mm-hmm.
or hymns, and it just lets me beginning of the day. It just let me feel like overwhelming calm and feel, God with me, and it also gives me an opportunity to walk a little bit, so it's kind of works as exercise as well, and it's really great when you just like you're in this park, you see the nature, you feel it, you're listening to all these hymns, and you're just intaking the nature, and you're just in. I don't know. All I can say is just you just feel this incredible awe of God,
Hmm.
and in the middle is just in the middle of the day, it's just giving myself breaks and checking myself, like where am I at mentally, and at the end of the day is just trying to end my day at peace.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very easy to uh, work, and then by the time you're done working, you just jump into bed, and you're like, well, that's the rest I need. No, you ideally do need to give yourself that little bit of downtime
Hmm.
from the computer to like calm your mind, to like almost like if your brain is almost like, I don't know how to describe it, like a car. You need to let it cool down first before you can before just completely shutting it off.
Hmm.
That analogy doesn't really make too much
No, I
sense.
think
But like,
I'm with you. Yeah.
but overall, just letting yourself cool down, and uh, I guess for me, for one, is as much as I can just be around people,
Mm-hmm.
because it can be really tough when uh, you're a lot of the time you're getting work done by yourself, and it's a high stress environment. When you're not around people, it can start to push you down to bad habits,
Mm-hmm.
and just overall make you feel icky.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah. Great.
yeah,
That's valuable.
yeah. Well, thank you, Micah, for
Thank you, sir.
being with us
Appreciate it.
today. And hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
We're out. Sweet.